This is a Frontline Club event recorded on the 4th of June 2020. From the Taliban to troop withdrawal. A discussion with Anthony Lloyd, Mujib Mashal, Michael Semple, and Hasina Syed.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the Frontline Club events. Today we're going to be talking about Afghanistan and particularly Afghanistan's future now that a peace deal looks imminent with the Taliban. I will remind you that you can ask questions. There's a little place at the bottom of the screen where you can type a question and I will review them regularly throughout the session. If you would prefer to ask it yourself, you can electronically put your hand up and that will allow me to come to you and you'll be able to ask your question out loud by joining us in audio. Let me first welcome my guests. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome, I think some of the most, the sharpest and most perspicacious, if you like, analysts of Afghanistan on the planet, and certainly in the world of media that I inhabit. I'm going to start with Hasina Syed. She is a businesswoman. She's an activist, she's an Afghan, she's the CEO of the Syed Group of companies, which operate in various sectors in Afghanistan, from agriculture to hotels. And she's also the founder of Now, an organization to support Afghan women in both business and society. And I know she has a great deal to say about this peace deal and the Taliban too, of course. Hasina, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Mujib Mashal is a journalist. He's based in Kabul. He's a longtime analyst and observer of Afghanistan, in fact, the whole region. He's written for many publications, including The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and Time Magazine, and currently he's the New York Times senior correspondent in Kabul. Mujib, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, Anthony Lloyd, British author and war correspondent who for decades has covered practically every conflict of our time, from the Balkans to Iraq and Syria, and of course, Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a country that he last visited very recently this spring in March. Anthony, hello and welcome.
Hello, Elizabeth.
We are expecting one more guest who's fighting Kabul traffic to get to his computer, and so I will introduce him to you if and we hope when he manages to hook up. But in the meantime, let's kick off by asking all of you in turn, starting with Hasina, is this peace deal good for Afghanistan?
I think every peace deal in whole over the world is very good for every nation. And it's very good for Afghanistan, and it depends on how you will make this deal. This is very important, and which way and which people are involved to make this peace deal. So it's very, very important for Afghanistan. That's why it's very critical moment right now for Afghanistan to make the right decision for how to bring the peace in an actual way, how you can involve a lot of people, the people who is very important for Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Mujib, how about you? Is the peace deal good for the future of Afghanistan?
First of all, I think I just want to say that the discussion around peace talks, but also just the current moment in Afghan history, it's a very deeply emotional moment, because we're talking about peace deal with a group that, oppressed minorities when it was in power, it denied women all their rights, but a group that is continuing, carnage and violence to the day they signed the deal with the Americans and afterwards to today. So it's a deeply emotional moment in that sense. Is the peace deal good or not? I would like to highlight the backdrop in which this peace deal is happening. It's a deeply flawed deal. It's an imperfect deal. But the reality is that the backdrop is one of shrinking leverage. You've got 20 years where we tried war. We tried defeating the Taliban militarily. The reality is this oppressive, violent group is a reality that needs to be reckoned with. In the backdrop of the biggest ally and partner in this war reminding every day that it's leaving. Whether you like it or not, whether you strike a deal or not, Trump reminds on a daily basis that it's leaving. So the deal, the idea of rushing to a deal to avoid the alternative of a withdrawal without some sort of an agreement that at least brings the Taliban into a political settlement to see if they can be changed. The question whether the Taliban have changed or not, I think that's a separate question. But whether they can be brought into a framework that avoids anarchy, that avoids further bloodshed. Existing levels of bloodshed is a reality. The question is, against a ticking clock, can there be some sort of a settlement, even if it's imperfect, even if it's flawed, that avoids a situation that is worse than today? I think that is the backdrop in which we're talking about a peace deal. And I think I like to sort of set the scene for discussion with reminding that backdrop, that we're not talking about an ideal peace deal. We're not talking about a peace deal where we have the luxury of time. We're talking about a peace deal where we've tried everything else, and the biggest ally that is sort of supporting and sustaining the democracy here is reminding on a daily basis that we're leaving whether you like it or not. That is the context in which we're talking about peace deal.
We'll come back to that. You raised some very good points that I want to explore further, but I'd like to hear from Anthony now. Is this deal with the Taliban good for Afghanistan and the future?
Elizabeth, picking up from the point Mujib just made about the lack of leverage and the backdrop of the haste and desire for an American withdrawal, so far, we're not talking about a peace deal. We're talking about an agreement that is principally focused on a scheduled American withdrawal. That withdrawal is not itself preconditioned to there being a peace agreement or to a peace agreement being implemented. Okay, so without those preconditions, what you've really got is a set of circumstances that loosely govern the time schedule for an American withdrawal. So whereby the Americans could fully withdraw under the terms of the Doha agreement, withdrawal agreement, by next year without any peace deal having been made between the Afghan government and Taliban, let alone implemented. So no one would deny the two great realities, which is America's been there for 20 years. America, by and large, wants to go. And I think many, many Afghans want the Americans to go. Point number one. Point number two, the vast majority of Afghans are absolutely exhausted by war, and that a peace agreement of some type, if it's possible, is of great importance to the people there in the country. However, so far, it looks like the backdrop to the deal, the withdrawal agreement that has been made, and the construct of it has actually given the Taliban a narrative of victory, which will be very, very hard for its negotiators to turn around and try and present them with actually some sort of negotiated compromise as being better than further war. And there is no traction that the Americans seem to have in their haste to get out by next year to persuade the Taliban to really seriously enter into a compromise series of talks with the government that result in some sort of settlement. So overall, I don't think the augurs are looking great.
Hasina, you surprised me a little bit when you said that you wanted a deal. I understand in principle any deal that brings peace is good for everybody to some extent, but surely Afghan women are particularly ones who've managed to gain some rights and perhaps are working in businesses or have jobs in the larger society, are very much afraid that a peace deal with the Taliban is going to turn back the clock on women's rights in a serious way.
I think I heard a lot interesting that from Mujib and from Anthony regarding that Afghan people like the Americans to withdraw. More in my point of view, in which I'm in contact with many Afghans, most of the people in Afghanistan, they don't want Americans to withdraw. because we know that Afghanistan is right now not a sustainable country. We need to have more development in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, in the past 18 years, 20 years, whatever happened, it was not, hasn't been worked the way we have to work, or the foreign people who came and kindly they wanted to help Afghan people in Afghanistan. They haven't done the work in a right manner, unfortunately, you can say that. So that's why we know that Afghanistan needs right now foreigners and foreign troops, because we are scared other people will come and take over, and then there will be another disaster and another story will begin in Afghanistan. So that's why we don't want really foreign withdrawal in Afghanistan. So, and your question was, sorry.
I was going to say, but they're going. They are going. That's a reality.
I'm not really totally agree, as I mentioned before in my other interviews, that I don't think so. Americans can withdraw, because first, as we know, the peace deal is going all over right now. The peace deal is not going in the right direction the way it's supposed to be. And this peace deal in Afghanistan's future is depends on Trump election. So we don't know if the Trump wins, President Trump wins, then the future of Afghanistan, we know then the future of Afghanistan once the election in the United States happen. So in my point of view, withdrawal of Americans is not, we don't know yet. We don't have this answer. Are they really serious to withdraw or not? So everything we will know on maybe October, November, then we will know what will be the future of Afghanistan.
Mujib, reality check. Is Hasina, does she have any reason to hope that the Americans might not withdraw? And I think then maybe could you just go through the main articles of the peace deal for people who haven't been following the coverage, but hold those thoughts while I welcome Michael Semple. Hello, Michael. Maybe you haven't got hooked up yet, have you?
Hi, Elizabeth.
Oh, hello. Very nice to see you. Good. Yes, perfect. Let me just quickly say.
Digital divide, I'm afraid.
Anyone who has followed the coverage of Afghanistan will know Michael. He's a scholar, he's an analyst, he's interested in conflict resolution in Afghanistan. He's worked for the NGOs, he's worked for the UN, he's worked for the EU, and he's been an academic at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Are you currently back in Kabul, Michael? Clearly you are.
Yes, I am very much in Kabul.
Yeah, in Kabul traffic.
Please pardon the slightly ropey internet connection.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Mujib. So do you want to take a run at those two questions I asked?
Sure. I think the question is, do we want to string hope to the idea that Americans and Trump might be bluffing? Do we want to wait out, and do we really want to see that day whether Trump was serious or not? Every indication is that he cannot wait to get out. He does not even, some of the most recent reporting suggests he does not even have the patience to wait in accordance to the schedule laid out in the peace deal. So to lay out the basics of the peace deal, it lays out a schedule for American troop withdrawal. And within the first 100 days or so, it was supposed to be reduced by 4,000 or 5,000, and then the rest of it is a gradual withdrawal. And in that phase, 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners, between 5,000 Taliban prisoners, 1,000 Afghan security forces to be exchanged. That opens the path for direct negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Every one of those steps, except for the troop withdrawal, has faced hurdles. So the way Anthony described it, that this is actually building the hope of a peace deal around the withdrawal that is happening, whether we like it or not. And in that reality, The fact that repeatedly the Afghan government has sort of hoped Trump might change his mind, hope that they might get through to Trump to get their way in how they want a peace deal, has repeatedly not succeeded. He seems stubborn in one priority, which is getting as much of his troops out as possible. In that reality, I think the way the peace deal was designed, the backdrop was Trump's urgency to get out. The second idea was that if you strike an agreement and give the Taliban their fundamental demand, which is the withdrawal of the American troops, in a way where you can still buy some time for negotiations and maintain some leverage, and then build on that initial momentum of having a breakthrough with the Taliban, you might get them into a framework where they abide by some of the changes of the past 20 years, where they respect some of that. The fact of the matter is that the deal centered on momentum. That momentum has been lost. Time has been lost. Initially, because the deal faced a hurdle as soon as it arrived in Kabul. The United States had struggled to convince its own ally in Kabul of elements of the deal. It got tangled up with Afghanistan's domestic electoral politics for months. That took time. It got tangled up in how the prisoners should be released or not released. It got overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And now it is overshadowed by what's happening in the United States. That probably a peace deal in Afghanistan is a long afterthought in the calculations of the US. So that central idea that was there to the deal, which was build momentum and hope the Taliban plays along, focus international attention, that has faded. And that's the reality check in the sense of where we are on the deal.
Michael, let me bring you in here. What's in it for the Taliban? What's the incentive for them to negotiate without really knowing when the US is going to leave? What's the incentive in the medium to long term?
Keep political pressure off their backers in Pakistan and to distract attention from what they're really doing, which is pursuing the military campaign to achieve a full restoration of the Islamic Emirate. I think that's been sort of the missing factor in the discussions. I agree with all the rest that I've heard, but I think we have to go back to what the Taliban are actually up to. They have managed to get the deal with the US so far without making any concessions other than saying that, okay, if the troops are out on their way, we don't need to fight the Americans. But vis-a-vis other Afghan political forces or the Afghan government, they have made no concessions whatsoever. I don't see their preparation for I don't see preparation for a negotiation process aiming at compromise and an agreed political setup. And au contraire, we see a military campaign which is from their perspective proceeding pretty smoothly.
Anthony, do you want to add to that? And I'm interested to know whether the Taliban leadership is sort of united on what the end game is, which if we accept what Michael's saying, it's to take over and wind the clock back to just post-Soviet occupation.
Elizabeth, that may be the case. It's very difficult to judge how exactly much the Taliban may or may not have changed since 2001, other than to say that most of their key leadership figures are very much the same. Just to finish an earlier question you put for the benefit of some of our listeners, what exactly are the tenets of the deal? So there are 4 simple tenets of the deal, and ultimately the deal gives the Taliban every one, I would argue, of their major demands and gives almost nothing to anybody else. So principally, the deal had 4 parts. There was a guarantee by the Taliban that Afghan soil wouldn't be used for any future terrorist attacks on the US. It didn't go so far as to say that Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups have to leave. It didn't go quite that far. It said that, you know, that there should be no funding or training of those groups, and they shouldn't be expressing, they didn't say aggressive desire against America, but it was kind of like, there was nothing saying they had to leave, but soil shouldn't be used for attacks against America. Point number 1. Point number 2, the overarching one, was the withdrawal schedule for the Americans. That was a very, very big deal, very big demand of the Taliban, which they achieved without ever having to speak to the Afghan government. Then you get the kind of nebulous point number 3, the start of intra-Afghan talks between finally the Afghan government and the Taliban, which haven't yet started. And then number 4, down the road, you get, you know, the kind of provision for permanent ceasefire or somewhere along the roadmap for the future of a maybe deal. So those are 4 points. Along the road, with all the other clauses, the Taliban gets sanctions lifted against them and all the rest of it. So ultimately, the Taliban got pretty much everything they could have wanted before real negotiations with the Afghan government even began. Plus, somewhere along the line, they got the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners thrown in as well, which is still ongoing. So the Taliban got an awful lot. The Afghan government were excluded from the original deal, and the Americans, you know, wrote off their withdrawal schedule in a way, as I've described earlier, which wasn't necessarily based on a final peace settlement or the implementation of a final peace settlement. So that's where we are now. The $1 million question is, vis-a-vis the Taliban, is how much have they changed since 2001? That's very difficult to answer, except if you look at the profile of their leadership pre-2001 and now. Well, not a whole lot changed. But also, what is the relationship between the negotiation between the Taliban delegation in Doha and the fighters on the ground? You know, the fighters on the ground suffered the most hideous casualties over the last few years. I think it was one of Mujib's reports I read, which suggested that up to 25% of the Taliban ground force became casualties in American airstrikes over the last 18 months or last year. I mean, huge, heinous casualties. And yet they've stuck with their aim, which they've been fighting for, which is for the restoration of an emirate. So at this point, when their delegation in Doha say, hey, we're not doing that anymore, we're going to negotiate with the Afghan government, and then we're going to kind of cook some power sharing deal. To the guys in the ground who sense this moment of victory. Let's see, Doha was advertised by Al-Qaeda as a great victory for, you know, global jihad. There was got no doubt about how they see it. The Taliban soldiery certainly see it as a victory. They see it as a victory over another superpower, their third superpower, Brits, Russians, and now Americans. It's going to be very, very difficult to rein the fighting force in, even if there is that will.
Let me just ask, Mujib, maybe you can tackle this. Does the deal attempt to see a power sharing agreement? In other words, eventually will the Taliban ask for and get some official role in the current Afghan government?
It doesn't. That is all left for a separate sort of track of direct negotiation between the Taliban and sort of the constitutional side of Afghanistan. The problem is, again, we go back to the original design of the deal. The design of the deal is rooted in the Americans leaving, whether we like it or not. The most clear message in the deal is the Americans are leaving. The clock has started ticking. Every other hurdle that other elements of the deal have faced we don't have evidence that slowed the clock. The withdrawal wasn't, the deal provided a space for this element of power sharing to be discussed. Against the ticking clock, on every passing day, the Taliban's reality, the Taliban's firepower, the Taliban's violence does not diminish. They've actually increased using violence and their battlefield reality as their leverage. But on the other side, the Afghan government side, what they have, the leverage they have at the table, unfortunately, is almost entirely dependent on the US. President Ghani has said his military wouldn't last for more than several weeks. Funding, something up to 70% of the Afghan government expenditure, public expenditure, is dependent on foreign aid. It is the military that is supposed to be defending this democratic system is a very expensive military. The vehicles, Ford, and the weapons from the US and everywhere against an insurgency that doesn't have that problem. That it is a cheaper insurgency. It is sources of income is not going to be affected much by. So in that reality, the idea of power sharing is set up in a way that by every passing day, the Taliban gain leverage and the Afghan government's leverage is reduced, particularly because it has tied its hopes to a partner that is unpredictable. Not only unpredictable, I would say worse than that, to a partner that has clearly signaled it doesn't really care about the consequences of its departure. That it's trying to minimize those consequences, but it is not tying its departure to the fate of women's rights, to democracy, to any values it threw money at over 20 years. It is leaving no matter what. It will make a last-ditch effort to try to preserve some of that, but it is not tying the pace of its withdrawal or its ultimate withdrawal to the fate of those things. Mm-hmm. And the Taliban see that on a daily basis. This question whether the Taliban are sort of using victorious rhetoric that we defeated and this next step is just a pushover, stems from the fact that since the deal, their reality hasn't changed much. Actually, as both Anthony and Michael and everybody said, they got everything they wanted out of this deal. And one of the biggest things they got was removing American air power from the battlefield. One thing that struck them hard over the years, particularly last year, where the US dropped about 7,500 bombs, and the majority of those were in the Taliban. Yes, a chunk of it was in the Islamic State, but the majority of those were the Taliban. They did away with that. That is no longer a concern for the Taliban. There is Afghan air power, and sometimes the US still carries out airstrikes. But for a large part, when you take that out of the battlefield equation, the Afghan forces are going to struggle. They're not going to be able to show much of a fight that forces the Taliban to change their triumphant equation. And that's going to play out in the talks about power sharing whenever we get to that.
Michael, how fast, once the US is out, will things start to come apart?
Depends on how the US leaves. If you're talking about a withdrawal to zero, in other words, no residual US military presence, and a cutoff on funding, I don't see any realistic scenario in which the Afghan government can take a stand against the Taliban. And yeah, I would say I've traveled around a fair amount of the country over the past month. For now, even with what Mujib rightly described, a massive reduction in US air power, on the ground, the US is nowhere to be seen. It's invisible. The Afghan forces are still holding their ground. Some places I visited, some of the local militias were working alongside the regular forces, and there was a sense that there is a reality to this Islamic Republic, government-held Afghanistan, the constitutional Afghanistan, if the US and its allies were minded to continue to support the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, to help them avoid the restoration of an Islamic emirate and achieve some kind of negotiated solution, not this summer, but like next year or whenever the Taliban realized that they weren't a pushover, that's viable. And I think that, but we, of course, nobody knows whether there anybody in the US is actually interested in doing that. One thing which does strike me here is that about the only force which seems, or the only two forces interested in restoring the Islamic Emirate and provoking the next round of civil war seem to be the Taliban themselves and their Al-Qaeda allies. Otherwise, the US, the European allies, I mean, Russia, China, even Pakistan are supposedly able to see that would be an extremely destabilizing and worrying outcome for basically all status quo powers in the area. So there are options available for increasing the staying power of the Islamic Republic, the Afghanistan as it is now, but all of those involve some degree of external support. The idea that the expensive Afghan army could survive, funded on the basis of customs revenue is just preposterous. It's just not going to happen.
Hasina, you've been listening to this largely bleak set of prognoses. If you accept that the US is going to leave, what are the greatest fears of Afghan women? And speak to me about urban women and also women in the countryside, where the Taliban in some places has just never gone away.
First of all, I'd like to add, before Taliban come to Afghanistan, the value of Afghan women in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, in this 18 years, whatever we have done for women, it hasn't been done enough to promote genuine Afghan women in Afghanistan. And all these things, I think Mujib will definitely agree with me, and Anthony, if he saw some articles regarding these issues, he will agree with me regarding the how the other they can work through the political parties to promote their women and put them in the areas where it is not good for them to, and they don't know how to run those seats. And fear of Afghan women before coming Taliban, we can see that how whenever our political leaders, they are sitting together making any kind of important negotiation about Afghanistan future, you hardly see any woman there. And Khalilzad, whenever he had some really serious negotiation with the Taliban or with some other political leaders, there was hardly, you can see, any woman there. So you can see even before Taliban come to our country, you can see most of the politicians, the powerful politicians, you can say their mentality that they don't accept that the woman can be in a room where you can discuss serious matter regarding future of Afghanistan. And you can see when there was agreement has been signed up with, it was President Ghani was in that room and some other political leaders were in that, between Abdullah and Ghani, there was no woman was there. So that's why I don't feel in most Afghan women, when they see these things. So what we have to accept or expect from Taliban if our women with our men with their ties and good English and went abroad and studied and well educated, they have this narrow-minded thinking about women. So how we can think about what will happen when Taliban come? Of course, they will learn definitely. And they, even when I met some of the Taliban leaders, they were even laughing on our educated male or political leaders. They were saying, look, you've been blaming us for not promoting you, but what about these people? So it's we fare a lot, even though we represent 50% of Afghanistan, because most of our men, they go for fighting, they get killed. We are the bread earner of our family after our men. But unfortunately, nobody doesn't take us seriously. Even international community haven't done enough to promote women or to really emphasize that you have to have women, even not only for pictures or for magazines or just to see how many women. They have to say what they have done and how you can promote strong women in the political sector, in any kind of sectors.
I'm going to start going to the questions, which are stacking up, and I'll start with one that came in by mail from Hadi Zahar, or email rather, and I'm going to pitch to you, Anthony, but I invite anybody else to pick up on this. He writes, the UN recently reported that contrary to the commitments made in the peace agreement, Taliban continue to maintain ties with Al-Qaeda. Given their whole alliance with various groups, not only Al-Qaeda, is it naive to think that any promises they make at the bargaining table about cutting ties with organizations like Al-Qaeda and maybe the Haqqani network are just empty? That there's just no way that essentially we can believe anything that they say?
There's a number of things there. First of all, though it's possible this next bit is included in a secret annex, I kind of doubt it. And even if it was included in a secret annex, it would be very hard to enforce. By what I'm talking about is how to monitor and how to enforce Taliban compliance of the clause in Doha, which says that they won't allow Afghan soil to be used as a base for terror groups to attack America. I mean, there's no mention at all about what an enforcement mechanism would be or what would happen if they didn't adhere to that. So that's point number one. Point number two, if you take it back to 2001, when the Americans demanded the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden, at the time, I mean, totally cognizant of what might be coming their way if they didn't hand over Osama, they still said, well, no, it's an old relationship, and, you know, if you want to come and give it to us, then go right ahead. We're not going to hand him over. So it's very unlikely they're going to have changed that kind of mentality now vis-a-vis their relationships with Al-Qaeda. Certainly the UN report, this was by and large based, the UN report, on research done in March, which I believe the report was actually drawn up in April and then released in May. And it charted the continued relationship, a deep relationship, very entwined, multi-level relationship, and the communications ongoing between Taliban and Al-Qaeda during Doha and afterwards. That's no huge surprise. Certainly if you speak to Taliban soldiers, it depends which area you go. I mean, a lot of guys in the south will have never seen, not necessarily an Arab, it could be an Indian member of Al-Qaeda, but if you go further over to the east, the relationship becomes a little more overt, and you speak to Taliban fighters there or commanders about, hey, well, are you going to break off your relationship with Al-Qaeda or its derivatives? And they're like, well, of course not. They're our brothers. They fought jihad with us. So we're not going to break our relationship with them.
Michael?
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that. I think, yeah, Auntie's right. This is not a question of being naive. This is a question of being empirical. The empirics tell us that the Taliban have intensified their relationship with Al-Qaeda and the other international jihadi factions in the wake of the signing. Although obviously the majority of fighters in the Taliban ranks are Afghans. there's a significant role for the foreign militants. That is intensified, it's systematic. They are contributing to the ongoing military campaign. Yeah, and certainly there's no sign of that changing. I think it's more, the interesting question is what's sellable in the US? What is the US still interested in? If I'd been trying to sell this deal in the US myself, I just would never have tried to sell it on this basis. But so far, it seems that the fact that they included these rather vaguely worded and softly worded promises means that Ambassador Khalilzad has been trying to sell this as one of the advantages of the deal. But the reality on the ground is that if the US completes its withdrawal from Afghanistan without a serious program of ongoing support for the Afghan government, then the Taliban, who roll back into power in Kabul, restoring the Islamic Emirate, will be triumphantly allied with Al Qaeda, and so it's not just a question of turning back the clock in terms of what's happened on women and social progress in Afghanistan. It would be one of the most spectacular turning back of the clock with regard to sort of the access of international Islamist forces to territory. And frankly, I think that's what the relics of Al Qaeda are looking forwards to. I have no sight of whether they have ongoing plots against New York and so on. That sort of seems a little bit almost belonging to the late to the 20th century, a long time ago. But they're certainly very much in propaganda mode, and I can imagine the way in which they would try to leverage the prospect of them moving into central Kabul to try and inspire fighters in multiple fronts. But again, this is not about naivety. This is about empirics. The empirics tell us that Taliban intelligence have strengthened their relationship with the foreign militants and rely on them for servicing the war effort. Practical terms. I mean, young Afghans who, like today, are being taught how to use thermal imaging equipment on sniper rifles so as to be more effective in killing Afghan forces. They are being taught by foreign militants. And there's more of that happening, frankly, post 29th February than, say, was happening in 2019. That's the way the war is going. If you actually look at the reality on the ground, rather than the rhetoric around these supposed negotiations and the deal.
So, Mujib, how likely is it that the U.S. Is going to maintain enough of a presence and keep funneling enough money to keep the Afghan state functioning and able to some extent negotiate with, if not ward off, increasing Taliban influence? Now, I know I'm asking you to look into the crystal ball, but go ahead.
Before I get to that, I think I have a comment on the Al Qaeda issue also.
Sure.
There's a history to this relationship that it's a 40-year relationship. We have to remember there was a time that who became bin Laden of the Al Qaeda was actually an ally of the U.S. on fighting on the same front, along with many of the senior leaders who became the Taliban later. There's an emotional relationship there. And even if you look at the past 20 years, the Taliban never, in the text of the deal, the Taliban didn't really admit to any wrongdoing. The Taliban, I remember there was a stretch in the negotiations in Doha where for 2-3 days, there was an emotional argument on who is a terrorist. Back and forth, because the US wanted the descriptor terrorist in the deal. And the US eventually caved in. The word terrorist is not there describing anyone in the deal. And so if the Taliban do split from Al Qaeda, it won't be because they have all of a sudden seen the light. it will be out of a convenience. A convenience because what remains of Al-Qaeda doesn't necessarily bring them anything. I slightly disagree with Michael on the fact that the Taliban would still require foreign trainers to show them how to, operate a laser weapon. It's been 20 years. Even if we look at the equivalence on the Afghan government side, on the ANDSF and the army and the police, they have enough trainers who've been trained that can do some of that training, right? So that really, if we do a calculation of what the Taliban get out of in a relationship of convenience with Al-Qaeda, as opposed to a relationship of 40 years of historic and emotional ties, I think those are two separate things. I don't think the Taliban get much out of a relationship of convenience with Al-Qaeda anymore, because in the big picture, they think they are a strong enough reality and presence. They lose more. They know for a fact, and this is from conversations with Taliban leaders, they know for a fact that if there's one red line the US has, it is they will continue, if they see the Taliban not respecting whatever vague splitting there is in those annexes about Taliban splitting from Al-Qaeda, they know the US military, they know the conservatives in the US, no matter how urgently they want to get out, that is one red line. They don't care about anything else. They do care about, the only thing that the US remembers in 20 years of what they've done here is September 11 and Al-Qaeda, right? And so if Taliban, if you're doing a political calculation, you cannot renounce them because it is going against 40-year history and emotional tie that they have. But going forward, what does it bring you is a tricky question, and so that's that. Looking forward in the crystal ball, I think in terms of the US maintaining enough leverage to ensure there won't be an Islamic emirate. That's another issue I disagree with Michael. The Taliban might desire an Islamic emirate. The Taliban might think they have a shot at the Islamic emirate, but conversations I've had about feasibility of that, I think they know clearly. They want something as close to it as possible, and they think they have the momentum to get something as close to it as possible. But I think they know well enough, they are sophisticated enough to know that before the Islamic emirate is a reality, anarchy and this country falling apart is more of a reality. Because then that becomes a domestic war, whether the US is here or not, that will continue to be fought. There are a lot of people who will rather fight a civil war, who would rather see whatever they can with the guns and arms they have, than accept the reality of an Islamic emirate. So I think the longer we wait to actually test out the real intentions of the Taliban at the negotiating table. Again, we're talking about what do the Taliban want before we have even seen them express it. This end game is moving so fast before we've even seen the Taliban go into the details of what do they believe on women's rights anymore, what do they believe on education, what do they believe on the form of government, right? When they comment about elections being fraudulent, right, that suggests they believe in some form of elections if they're criticizing not the principle of elections, but the way elections happened. And yet they're remaining vague on expressing sort of their thoughts on any of those things. But we have these notions that they will not come short of an Islamic emirate. I think we need to test that out. We haven't tested it. But the more we waste time before we test them out is giving them more leverage to stick closer to that ambition they have of Islamic emirate. Because this side will sort of keep shrinking its leverage. But I have to say, in terms of funding for governance, for system and things like that, there's been clear signaling the past couple of years or so that the US, especially if Trump gets reelected, he thinks in sort of monetary terms, the US is not going to be sustaining the levels of, particularly post-COVID-19 pandemic, where you've got tens of millions of people losing their jobs in the US. The US is going to look for an excuse to cut corners in every way it can. And in that reality, to expect a kind of funding that has almost been luxurious in the past 20 years to continue to sustain a system that is struggling, I think, again, we can't pin hope to that. The world reality is such that even continuing current levels of funding, anything beyond the basic military and security funding is going to be deeply, deeply affected. And then the consequences of that on sort of the sustainability of the democratic system, once the money is sort of shrinks out of it, what political consequences, what security consequences that will have when the Afghan government can deliver on top of not being able to protect against a brutal insurgency. Those are factors, those are bigger questions tied to funding that we need to be discussing, and we need to be talking in the context of the urgency for negotiations.
I'd like to, yes, Haseen, I'll come to you right away. I just want to plant an idea here. I've got a question from Izzatullah Mirdad, who says, how will the return of the Taliban empower extremists in Afghanistan and elsewhere? And is it going to start damaging the cause of moderate Sunnis in the region? And I'd really like to hear you talk about ISIS, and because they're now a player too, and that wasn't the case in 2001. But before we go there, Hasina, you would like to say something. Go ahead.
I like to talk regarding these three issues which we are talking about: the Taliban, how they will come to integrate inside Afghan government or Afghan society. So Afghan people will only accept the Taliban through democratic election, which is very important, and nobody hasn't thought about it. You can't just bring Taliban and impose on Afghan government. It's not going to be happen. First. Second, this is a very short, I can explain more, but I understand there's a lot of people waiting for other question. And the other question, which I always say regarding why I am expecting that maybe US government will not going to withdraw. Of course, I understand that what Mujib say, that some of the funding has been reduced and because of the COVID-19, and it's very important subject also indeed. But as we don't know when Trump election, if he wins or if he doesn't win, because the opposition also want the US troop not to be withdrawn in Afghanistan. I think last his speech you can hear, and I heard, everybody heard that he said, I'm going to keep the US troop in Afghanistan. And regarding Trump's election, if he won, you never know what he will tweet the next day. So it's a huge surprising. He can do anything which is benefit for him. And especially war is a business. And Afghanistan is a perfect place for any business people who really want to experiment their guns, their mother of all bombs or something, because we don't have those very strong government who can ask questions about, okay, you put the mother of bomb, all the bombs in Afghanistan, what damages it can create, what's our next future will get those damages, whatever happened about the chemicals. So that's why in my point of view, we can't really say, yes, indeed, there is a lot of things has been drawn up, or there is a lot of things has been stopped. But it's mostly, which I was talking the other day with some senior officials in the U.S. government. They did mention regarding this, for example, Lockheed Martin or other companies has reduced, but we don't know what will happen the next time once the election, President Trump win the election. then we will know the future of Afghanistan, because this politics is so confusing. It can be, as we saw in Afghanistan, Mujib knows about it, that during the presidential election of Afghanistan, everybody was leaning one time to peace negotiation, and then they were saying, no, peace is not important, election is important. So everybody was, because I was involved very much during election with the presidential candidates, and everybody was concentrating on presidential election. So it was like we were all concentrating what Trump wants to say, what they are believing, my Pompeo will say, what Khalilzad wants to say. So Afghanistan is 100% relying on US policies, on what they are going to, they are telling our fate where to go. And regarding the Taliban, where they are going to get their funding, indeed, we know, and as Mujib mentioned before, that US government did promise the Taliban that they have sufficient fund they will give once the Taliban join Afghan government. But and also I talked with some other embassies, I can't name the names, and they were saying that yes, true, we will be also willing to help them out once they are integrated in the government. So we don't know, still I don't want to say 100% that will US government, US troops will withdraw from Afghanistan 100%, or is just as a myth, just to make people confused, or they will be panicking. Everybody is now in a panic mood right now, especially Afghan government, the Taliban. Even if, for example, even if we think that US government 100% will withdraw, which will be not, because of there's a lot of other issues like our neighboring countries and all those things. So then it's not going, this Afghanistan will be the hub of terrorists. And this hub, if it happened, it's not going to stay only in Afghanistan. It can grow to other countries.
That's exactly what I'd like to move on to next. And I'd like to talk about that and also ISIS in the region. Who'd like to kick off on that? Anthony?
Sure, I'll kick off on that. So first of all, I think, and it feeds into an answer on ISIS, first of all, we should be very clear about what the consequences are of if Doha fails completely. And I think we've been kind of focusing like, oh, well, maybe if the Islamic Emirate comes back, that could be the worst thing for Afghanistan of all. Well, one, I think we're sort of agreed it's not going to come back just like that. But secondarily, I don't think that is the worst thing of all. I think there's something infinitely more likely, which is the Americans, as it seems, proceed with our withdrawal regardless, that there could be a civil war in Afghanistan reflecting the previous worst era of recent Afghan history, which was 1992 to 2001, when there was a civil war then, and Kabul itself was fought over from, say, 1992 until 1996. Much of the city destroyed. You had, I think, up to 6 million Afghans as refugees. The dead were uncounted. I mean, they were far in excess of anything that has happened since then. So, you know, the consequence of this all going wrong, it's not an either there's a peace settlement or the Taliban will come back as Islamic Emirates in power. There's something much worse in between, which is at stake here if this comes off the rails. Now, feeding into that, the Islamic State, so it came quite suddenly, if my mind is correct, that the date was kind of late 2014, 2015. Islamic State came in from Pakistan. People were saying at the beginning, oh, is it really Islamic State or is it some sort of derivative faction, Pakistani backs? Well, at the end of the day, you know, it looked like a duck and it sounded like a duck and it probably was, you know, Islamic State. They've had various peaks and troughs ever since. And last autumn, in fact, they were defeated very heavily in eastern Afghanistan by largely the Taliban. When it actually came down to it, Islamic State had endured a lot of American bombing, but when it actually came down to it being cleared out of the valleys, it was done largely by the Taliban. The others will correct me if I'm wrong with that. What you're seeing now is a resurgence of Islamic State using a slightly different tactic, which is again of bombings. It would seem Mujib will know better than I that the maternity hospital attack was Islamic State. I mean, that's certainly what the Americans said. Islamic State didn't claim it, but perhaps they wouldn't wish to. The worry with Islamic State is not so much that they're hugely powerful now, but that disaffected Taliban groups who do not like the way Doha might go coalesce then around Islamic State. And so what I'm saying is that there is a danger that a larger body of Taliban might enter some form of reasonable and real negotiation, but you'll have a huge amount of splinter factions going off and coalescing around or alongside Islamic State. So that's from my side where we are with that.
Michael, if you'd like to pick up, and my question is Islamic State a competitor to the Taliban or a potential partner?
Taliban and Islamic States are not just potential competitors; they are very real competitors. Essentially, the hallmark of Taliban strategy over the past 2.5 decades has been to try and establish a monopoly over the jihad in Afghanistan. They right from the emergence of the Islamic State, that was a threat to that monopoly. The Taliban have been ruthless in fighting against them, and I expect that to continue. However, Islamic State have, for their part, they have exploited essentially the power vacuum created in bits of Afghanistan by the success of the Taliban insurgency. So whereas that the two leaderships are at loggerheads, many of the personnel know each other and and have flitted between the two organizations, and clearly Islamic State have exploited the progress of the Taliban. And even when it comes down to attributing some of the attacks, only when you've done the forensics can you really attribute specific terrorist attacks. I consider it an entirely plausible hypothesis that those who have run the Taliban suicide bombing and complex attack campaign against Kabul, having been put on essentially on hold by the need to maintain support for this Qatar process, they haven't been able to have Taliban flagged attacks around Kabul, and so it's entirely plausible that actually Taliban or groups working closely with the Taliban have been responsible for attacks like the attacks on the Mazari celebrations in West Kabul in March, but allow Islamic State to claim credit. Islamic State for the moment have lost almost all their capability. They've lost almost all their control of territory, almost all their ability to carry out such attacks, and yet conveniently some of those attacks keep on happening. And this is something which ultimately has got to be settled empirically, and not just politically. I know that lots of people would like it's convenient for people who want to say that the Taliban are complying with their obligations under Doha to say, of course, Islamic State carry these things out. And the same applies to, the points that Mujib on his political logic around what a reasonable Taliban leadership would do, saying we really don't want to be associated with Al-Qaeda because it will inhibit our ability to get to legitimize the Taliban's return to power or a share of power. If I were advising the Taliban leadership, I would certainly warn them to take that position. Stay away from Al-Qaeda. They won't do. They can't offer you anything much. However, when I talk about what has happened post 29th February, I talk empirically. I talk what they're actually doing. I think it's an incredibly bad idea for the Taliban to be on foreign militants, to be the thermal imaging kit, but they are doing it. The first high-profile suicide attack, which the Taliban carried out after the deal, was up in Badghis, and the suicide bombers were from an Al-Qaeda affiliate. So we know empirically that they have opted to maintain that relationship. And I think that it's a warning to all of us. Of course, it's good to follow political logic, and and it's good to encourage people to sensible behaviour. But when trying to work out what is actually happening, we should look at what's going on in the ground. So the same applies to what we're talking about, the prospects for negotiations and getting some kind of deal which does indeed bring an end to the Afghan conflict before the US leaves the scene. When I probe what the Taliban, the military, the people who are actually calling the shots on the ground are doing, I mean, they are sustaining their military leadership. They're trying to poise themselves to be able to squeeze the Afghan government further and basically put themselves in a position to take the lot without any need for a negotiated settlement, a power sharing agreement. So the discussions with bits of the Taliban leadership and what's happened in Qatar, but the reality amongst Taliban on the ground is a push to try and grab the lot. Now, if that sounds pessimistic, I do want to jump ahead to something which we should be thinking ahead in the sense what Afghanistan will look like in 2021, because if a way is found to get through this year with either a US exit or US pushing to a massively reduced presence which they can sustain, if the political deal holds in Kabul, if, as Mujib asks for, I mean that the Taliban are they're put to the test. Are you prepared to come on board with a compromised political settlement? And they keep talking but don't actually reach a deal. The interesting question is, how long can the Taliban actually sustain their campaign against an Afghan government while there are compromise settlements on the deal? Because if there's one thing that does encourage me from what's happened in Qatar this year, is the Taliban have said quite clearly we are no longer fighting against foreign occupation, and that's extremely important. Anybody who was mobilized to the fight because they wanted to fight to get the Americans out has been told that's over now. The only reason to fight on now is to fight over who's empowering Kabul and the details of what the regime will look like. At the moment, the Taliban are successfully mobilizing their fighters to sustain that fight. If the Afghan government holds its position, ultimately it's going to become more difficult for the Taliban to do what happened a generation before, which was to arm and encourage young Afghans to go and carry on killing fellow Afghans, fellow Muslims as part of a power struggle in the country. I mean, that's a state of the conflict in a sense we haven't yet reached. And when in traveling around the country, I certainly get the message that there is a lot of war fatigue on both sides. That they, despite the different visions of power in both sets of leaderships, at the base, my understanding is that Afghans are ready for an end to this conflict.
Majida, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that it would be difficult in the long run for the Taliban to get fighters to fight other Afghans, in other words, participate in a civil war? And we've got a couple of people here asking about the maternity hospital attack, and you covered it. We'd like to know what you made of it, who did it, and why. So do you want to take a quick stab at both of those?
Was that to me? Kind of.
Yeah.
Was that the question?
Yes, it is. Yes, Majid. Yeah.
I think on the Taliban's ability to mobilize after the legitimacy of fighting a foreign occupation. At the moment, it seems like nothing has changed their ability to mobilize. And there are worrying signs that nothing changed despite some of the worst waves of airstrikes and sort of military force used against them. And that certainly isn't going to change after they are heavily pushing propaganda of triumph. If you watch their latest videos, it is fascinating because when you watch, there have been two recent videos of their trainings and they increasingly project themselves as an organized force. They're all uniformed, the way they march, the way they train. You no longer see the old turban, flip-flop wearing Taliban with an AK-47. You see them in like commando gear. You see them in, very organized marches. So when you take that kind of propaganda and that goes down to the ground and tie it with a sense that we got after 20 years what we wanted, I don't think their ability to mobilize is going to change much, particularly when the next phase of this fight becomes about resources, about control, about power. That those are elements and components tied together that would tell me their mobilization will not change much. The risk is, unless right now at this moment we take whatever the Taliban as a force is bring them into a framework where it is agreeable to both sides, we are going to go into what will be a war over power. And as Anthony mentioned, every fear that we have right now about Afghanistan turning into safe haven for foreign terrorists, about women's rights and suffering, about liberties and freedoms, that's going to be much worse in a space of civil war over power and anarchy than it will be in a compromise deal that doesn't please anyone. But I go back to the point that every sort of analysis of what is a Taliban, I think, is right. They're not breaking with Al-Qaeda, their sense of wanting to fight it out until they get to an emirate, the disconnect potentially between the political leaders and the military leaders on the ground. Let's assume all of that is 100% accurate. That is what we're faced with. And on the other hand, the reality is the conditions to change them from what they are have been exhausted. Pinning hope to whether it's military force, whether it's sanctions, whether it's getting Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, everybody on board to hope to bring a changed Taliban to the negotiating table, I think is wasting time. Because the leverage we need, the patience we need, the signaling we need that we will wait here until you change is not there. That has been signaled. That's so. I think the question of Taliban's mobilization, I don't see that changing after in the next phase of it. But I go back to your question about Islamic State briefly. What is Islamic State in the East has significantly been reduced. It's lost most of its territory. And I agree with Michael that there is always a disconnect, at least in my analysis and my coverage, of what happened in urban centers and what happened in, say, Nangarhar. What was claimed in the urban centers as Islamic State suicide bombings conveniently helped the Taliban's cranking up pressure on a government that couldn't protect its population, right? What do the Taliban lose in suicide bombings being carried out in Kabul? Nothing. They gain from it, and the Islamic State gave this cover where they didn't have to, then carry that into negotiations. And I know this might be a very shallow point, but when you connect, when you see the phase where the Islamic State claimed attacks in Kabul increased, and when you see the reduction in whatever was Haqqani claimed attacks, Taliban claimed attacks, there's a correlation there. And just the fact that where those attacks happened and the consequence of those attacks was never people rallying against Islamic extremism, people saying, government, you can't protect us, government, you can't protect us. And the pressure of that further shrinks the legitimacy and the say that the Afghan government has. So when we take that, whatever is the Islam, so to go to the hospital attack, Taliban said we didn't do it. The Afghan government said, no, it was a Taliban. There's a convenient middle group that we were told was defeated, repeatedly was defeated in Nangarhar, that still remains as a reality. So in this context, I feel like my fear is on the Islamic State. My fear is ungoverned spaces have been exploited here before. The Islamic State is not coming into a vacuum of, no history of extremist views in this country, in this geography. It is coming into a space that has that history already. But if we track that history, a lot of it has exploited ungoverned spaces. If we go into a reality of a stalemate the way it is right now, we have already maximized what the government can do in terms of exerting control. If it continues like this, that middle space will keep on growing to be exploited, whether it's for convenience by the Taliban to carry out violence, and then the claim coming from Islamic State, or whether what is actually Islamic State, that elements of it were here. Are there other places looking for territory to continue to survive? It will exploit that middle ground. So again, that was my 2 cents on the Islamic State.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid I knew this would happen. We've run out of time. We haven't nearly explored the subject as much as I would like. You've all been wonderful. Hasina, thank you very much for joining us. Mujib, it's an honor to have you. Michael, terrific that you were able to join us. And thanks for fighting your way through traffic. And Anthony, it's a real pleasure. I want to thank everybody who asked questions and didn't get them in. We did our best. And I want to invite you all to join us again next week. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.